Hey, good evening. Welcome back to Voluntaryist Academy, where you can come to learn what it's going to take to be free. Voluntarism leads to anarchy. Anarchy just simply means without rulers, a state of absolute freedom. How do we get to that condition? We get there by changing our actions, and we change our actions into respecting other people's natural law rights, and we uh, perform, voluntary interactions with people. Don't coerce people into doing things. Don't take people's stuff. Pretty simple stuff. We get into stuff like that every night here. So tonight, what we're getting into is an essay written by Gustave de Molinari back in 1849. This is pretty important stuff. He's like the first person to ever posit this solution to a problem that laissez-faire, free market, economists, a lot of anti-state philosophers from back in the 19th century, what they were trying to figure out. And one of the questions that always came up was, well, you need government to provide protection services. You need government to provide you with military and police, or else it's just going to be chaos. And no one could really figure out an argument against that until Gustave de Molinari came along and figured out a way to kind of put it together and say, no. The free market can also provide for security and defense. So that's what we're going to get into tonight. We're not going to get so much into this utopia of liberty, a letter to socialists. I mean, we might. I feel how it depends on how I feel at the end of the presentation, because the presentation that I'm actually going to show you does not include this letter, so I might actually just have to read it from the book itself. We'll see how we can do that. Maybe we'll do it here on the old book cam. The copy I have is from the Mises Institute, and you can find your own copy there as well of this. And without any further ado, let's get into it. So, The Production of Security by Gustave de Molinari. And so this essay was originally published as De la Production de la Sécurité, or whatever, however you say it in French, in Journal des Economistes in February of 1849. This translation was originally published as Gustave de Molinari. I don't know. This translation was originally published as Gustave de Molinari, The Production of Security. Translation was done by J. Houston McCullough in the Occasional Papers series number 2, the Richard M. Ebling edition in New York, the Center of Liberty Studies in May 1977. And this copyright that I'm reading from is circa 2009 from the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Okay, so Gustave de Molinari said, "The interests of the consumer of any commodity whatsoever should always prevail over the interests of the producer." Okay, let's do the preface by Murray and Rothbard in 1977. Never has laissez-faire thought been as dominant as it was among French economists, beginning with J.B. Say in the early 19th century, down through Say's more advanced followers, Charles Comte and Charles Denoyer, and to the early years of the 20th century. For nearly a century, the laissez-faire economists controlled the professional economic society, the Société d'économie politique, and its journal, the Journal des Economistes, as well as numerous other journals and university posts. And yet, few of these economists were translated into English, and virtually none are known to English or American scholars. The sole exception being Frederick Bastiat, not the most profound of the group. The entire illustrious group remains unstudied and unsung. The most extreme and consistent, as well as the longest-lived and most prolific of the French laissez-faire economists, was the Belgian-born Gustave de Molinari. He lived from 1819 to 1912. He edited the Journal des Economistes for several decades. The initial article of the young Molinari, here translated for the first time as, quote, the production of security, end quote, was the first presentation anywhere in human history of what is now called anarcho-capitalism, or free market anarchism. Molinari did not use the terminology and probably would have balked at the name. In contrast to all previous individualistic and near-anarchist thinkers, such as Labode, Hodgkin, or the young Fichte, Molinari did not base the brunt of his argument on a moral position to the state. While an ardent individualist, Molinari grounded his argument on free market, laissez-faire economics and proceeded logically to ask the question, if the free market can and should supply all other goods and services, why not also the services of protection? During the same year, 1849, Molinari expanded his radically new theory into a book, Les Soirées de la Rue Saint-Lazare, a series of fictional dialogues between three people. The conservative, who was an advocate of high tariffs and state monopoly privileges, the socialist, and the economist, which was himself. The final dialogue elaborated further on his theory of free market protective services. 4 decades later, in his Les lois naturelles de l'économie politique in 1887, look, I'm trying with the French here. I speak only English, so pardon my French, get it? See what I did there? Molinari was still a firm believer. So in 1887, when he wrote that, he was still a firm believer in privately competitive police companies, public works companies, and defense companies. Unfortunately, in his only work to be translated into English, The Society Future, The Society of Tomorrow, in New York, G.P. Putnam's Sons, 1904, Molinari had partially retreated to an advocacy of a single monopoly private defense and protection company rather than allowing free competition. It is instructive to note the storm of contention that Molinari's article and his soirées brought about in the laissez-faire stalwarts of French economics. A meeting of the Société d'économie politique in 1849 was devoted to Molinari's daring new book, The Soirées. Charles Coquelin opined that justice needs a quote-unquote supreme authority, and that no competition in any area can exist without the supreme authority of the state. In a similarly unsupported and a priori fulmination, Frederick Bastiat declared that justice and security can only be guaranteed by force, and that force can only be the attribute of a quote-unquote supreme power, the state. Neither commentator bothered to engage in a critique of Molinari's arguments. Only Charles Denoyer did so, complaining that Molinari had been carried away by the quote-unquote illusions of logic and maintaining that, quote, competition between governmental companies is chimerical because it leads to violent battles, end quote. Denoyer instead chose to rely on the quote-unquote competition of political parties within representative government, hardly a satisfactory libertarian solution to the problem of social conflict. He also opined that it was most prudent to leave force in the hands of the state, where civilization has put it, quote unquote, where civilization has put it. This is from one of the great founders of the conquest theory of the state. Unfortunately, this critical issue was barely treated in the meeting, since the discussion largely centered on Denoyer's and other economists criticizing Molinari for going too far in attacking all uses of eminent domain by the state. See Journal des Economistes 24, published at October 15th, 1849, pages 315 and 316. With this publication of Professor McCullough's translation of Molinari's original article, let us hope that Molinari will now come to the attention of scholars and translators. So here we go. Let's read the article. All right. Check it out. Check out here we go. That's a good question in the chat. I'll get to the chat after I get through the article. That's usually how I do things here. So I appreciate your participation. Drop a comment in the chat. Say hello, like, subscribe, do all that crazy stuff. Really helps out the channel. So let's get into this. The Production of Security by Gustave de Molinari. Maybe your question, Arthur, will be answered in this. So let's hang on and read it. Let's get it. There are two ways of considering society. According to some, the development of human associations is not subject to providential, unchangeable laws. Rather, these associations, having originally been organized in a purely artificial manner by primeval legislators, can later be modified or remade by other legislators, in step with the progress of social science. In this system, the government plays a preeminent role, because it is upon it the custodian of the principle of authority, that the daily task of modifying and remaking society devolves. According to others, on the contrary, society is a purely natural fact. Like the earth on which it stands, society moves in accordance with general, pre-existing laws. In this system, there is no such thing, strictly speaking, as social science. There is only economic science, which studies the natural organism of society and shows how this organism functions. We propose to examine, within the later system, the function and natural organization of government. Okay, so chapter, the natural order of society. In order to define and delimit the function of government, it is first necessary to investigate the essence and object of society itself. What natural impulse do men obey when they combine into society? They are obeying the impulse, or, to speak more exactly, the instinct of sociability. The human race is essentially sociable. Like beavers and the higher animal species in general, men have an instinctive inclination to live in society. Why did this instinct come into being? Man experiences a multitude of needs, on whose satisfaction his happiness depends, and whose non-satisfaction entails suffering. Alone and isolated, he could only provide in an incomplete, insufficient manner for these incessant needs. The instinct of sociability brings him together with similar persons and drives him into communication with them. Therefore, impelled by the self-interest of the individuals thus brought together, a certain division of labor is established, necessarily followed by exchanges. In brief, we see an organization emerge, by means of which man can more completely satisfy his needs than he could living in isolation. This natural organization is called society. The object of society is therefore the most complete satisfaction of man's needs. The division of labor and exchange are the means by which this is accomplished. Among the needs of man, there is one particular type which plays an immense role in the history of humanity, namely the need for security. What is this need? It is in one's self-interest to procure security at the lowest price possible. Whether they live in isolation or in society, men are, above all, interested in preserving their existence and the fruits of their labor. If the sense of justice were universally prevalent on earth, if consequently each man confined himself to laboring and exchanging the fruits of his labor without wishing to take away, by violence or fraud, the fruits of other men's labor, if everyone had, in one word, an instinctive horror of any act harmful to another person, it is certain that security would exist naturally on earth, and that no artificial institution would be necessary to establish it. Unfortunately, this is not the way things are. The sense of justice seems to be the prerequisite of only a few eminent and exceptional temperaments. Among the inferior races, it exists only in a rudimentary state. Hence the innumerable criminal attempts ever since the beginning of the world, since the days of Cain and Abel, against the lives and property of individuals. Hence also the creation of establishments whose object is to guarantee to everyone the peaceful possession of his person and goods. These establishments were called governments. Everywhere, even among the least enlightened tribes, one encounters a government. So universal and urgent is the need for security provided by government. Everywhere, men resign themselves to the most extreme sacrifices rather than do without government and hence security, without realizing that in doing so, they misjudge their alternatives. Suppose that a man found his person and his means of survival incessantly menaced. Wouldn't his first and constant preoccupation be to protect himself from the dangers that surround him? This preoccupation, these efforts, this labor, would necessarily absorb the greater portion of his time, as well as the most energetic and active faculties of his intelligence. In consequence, he could only devote insufficient and uncertain efforts in his divided attention to the satisfaction of his other needs. Even though this man might be asked to surrender a very considerable portion of his time and his labor to someone who takes it upon himself to guarantee the peaceful possession of his person and his goods, wouldn't it be to his advantage to conclude this bargain? Still, it would obviously be no less in his self-interest to procure his security at the lowest price possible. Next is the competition insecurity. If there is one well-established truth in political economy, it is this, that in all cases, for all commodities that serve to provide for the tangible or intangible needs of the consumer, it is in the consumer's best interest that labor and trade remain free, because the freedom of labor and of trade have as their necessary and permanent result the maximum reduction of price. And this, that the interests of the consumer of any commodity whatsoever should always prevail over the interests of the producer. Now, in pursuing these principles, one arrives at this rigorous conclusion, that the production of security should, in the interests of the consumers of this intangible commodity, remain subject to the law of free competition. Whence it follows that no government should have the right to prevent another government from going into competition with it, or to require consumers of security to come exclusively to it for this commodity. Nevertheless, I must admit that, up until the present, one recoiled before this rigorous implication of the principle of free competition. One economist, who has done as much as anyone to extend the application of the principle of liberty, Charles de Noyer, thinks, quote, that the functions of government will never be able to fall into the domain of private activity, end quote. Now here is a citation of a clear and obvious exception to the principle of free competition. This exception is all the more remarkable for being unique. Undoubtedly, one can find economists who establish more numerous exceptions to this principle, but we may emphatically affirm that these are not pure economists. True economists are generally agreed, on the one hand, that government should restrict itself to guaranteeing the security of its citizens, and on the other hand, that the freedom of labor and of trade should otherwise be whole and absolute. But why should there be an exception relative to security? What special reason is there that the production of security cannot be relegated to free competition? Why should it be subjected to a different principle and organized according to a different system? On this point, the masters of the science are silent, and de Noyer, who has clearly noted this exception, does not investigate the grounds on which it is based. So we're going to ask the question, security an exception? We are consequently led to ask ourselves whether this exception is well-founded in the eyes of the economist. It offends reason to believe that a well-established natural law can admit of exceptions. A natural law must hold everywhere and always, or be invalid. I cannot believe, for example, that the universal law of gravitation, which governs the physical world, is ever suspended in any instance or at any point of the universe. Now I consider economic laws comparable to natural laws, and I have just as much faith in the principle of the division of labor as I have in the universal law of gravitation. I believe that while these principles can be disturbed, they admit of no exceptions. But if this is the case, the production of security should not be removed from the jurisdiction of free competition. And if it is removed, society as a whole suffers a loss. Either this is logical and true, or else the principles on which economic science is based are invalid. So the alternatives. It thus has been demonstrated a priori to those of us who have faith in the principles of economic science that the exception indicated above is not justified, and that the production of security, like anything else, should be subject to the law of free competition. Once we have acquired this conviction, what remains for us to do? It remains for us to investigate how it has come about that the production of security has not been subjected to the law of free competition, but rather has been subjected to different principles. What are those principles? Those of monopoly and communism. In the entire world, there is not a single establishment of the security industry that is not based on monopoly or on communism. In this connection, we add, in passing, a simple remark. Political economy has disapproved equally of monopoly and communism in the various branches of human activity, wherever it has found them. Is it not then strange and unreasonable that it accepts them in the security industry? Monopoly and communism. Let's go. Let us now examine how it is that all known governments have either been subjected to the law of monopoly or else organized according to the communistic principle. First, let us investigate what is understood by the words monopoly and communism. It is an observable truth that the more urgent and necessary a man's needs, the greater will be the sacrifices he will be willing to endure in order to satisfy them. Now, there are some things that are found abundantly in nature and whose production does not require a great expenditure of labor, but which, since they satisfy these urgent and necessary wants, can consequently acquire an exchange value all out of proportion with their natural value. Take salt, for example. Suppose a man or a group of men succeed in having the exclusive production and sale of salt assigned to themselves. It is apparent that this man or group could raise the price of this commodity well above its value, well above the price it would have under a regime of free competition. One will say that this man or this group possesses a monopoly, and that the price of salt is a monopoly price. But it is obvious that the consumers will not consent freely to paying the abusive monopoly surtax. It will be necessary to compel them to pay it, and in order to compel them, the employment of force will be necessary. Every monopoly necessarily rests on force. When the monopolists are no longer as strong as the consumers they exploit, what happens? In every instance, the monopoly finally disappears either violently or as the outcome of an amicable transaction. What is it replaced with? If the roused and insurgent consumers secure the means of production of the salt industry, in all probability they will confiscate this industry for their own profit, and their first thought will be not to relegate it to free competition, but rather to exploit it, in common, for their own account. They will then name a director or a directive committee to operate the salt works, to whom they will allocate the funds necessary to defray the costs of salt production. Then, since the experience of the past will have made them suspicious and distrustful, since they will be afraid that the director named by them will seize production for his own benefit, and simply reconstitute by open or hidden means the old monopoly for his own profit, they will elect delegates, representatives entrusted with appropriating the funds necessary for production, with watching over their use and with making sure that the salt produced is equally distributed to those entitled to it. The production of salt will be organized in this manner. This form of organization of production has been named communism. When this organization is applied to a single commodity, the communism is said to be partial. When it is applied to all commodities, the communism is said to be complete. But whether communism is partial or complete, Political economy is no more tolerant of it than it is of monopoly, of which it is merely an extension. Next, the monopolization and collectivization of the security industry. Isn't what has just been said about salt applicable to security? Isn't this the history of all monarchies and all republics? Everywhere, the production of security began by being organized as a monopoly, and everywhere, nowadays, it tends to be organized communistically. Here is why. Among the tangible and intangible commodities necessary to man, none, with the possible exception of wheat, is more indispensable, and therefore none can support quite so large a monopoly duty, nor is any quite so prone to monopolization. What, indeed, is the situation of men who need security? Weakness. What is the situation of those who undertake to provide them with the necessary security? Strength. If it were otherwise, if the consumers of security were stronger than the producers, they obviously would dispense with their assistance. Now, if the producers of security are originally stronger than the consumers, won't it be easy for the former to impose a monopoly on the latter? Everywhere, when societies originate, we see the strongest, most warlike races seizing the exclusive government of the society. Everywhere we see these races seizing a monopoly on security within certain more or less extensive boundaries, depending on their number and strength. And this monopoly being, by its very nature, extraordinarily profitable, everywhere we see the races invested with the monopoly on security devoting themselves to bitter struggles in order to add to the extent of their market the number of their forced consumers, and hence the amount of their gains. War has been the necessary and inevitable consequence of the establishment of a monopoly on security. Another inevitable consequence has been that this monopoly has engendered all other monopolies. When they saw the situation of the monopolizers of security, the producers of other commodities could not help but notice that nothing in the world is more advantageous than monopoly. They, in turn, were consequently tempted to add to the gains from their own industry by the same process. But what did they require in order to monopolize? To the determined detriment of the consumers, the commodity they produced? They required force. However, they did not possess the force necessary to constrain the consumers in question. What did they do? They borrowed it for a consideration from those who had it. They petitioned and obtained, at the price of an agreed-upon fee, the exclusive privilege of carrying on their industry within certain determined boundaries. Since the fees for these privileges brought the producers of security a goodly sum of money, the world was soon covered with monopolies. Labor and trade were everywhere shackled and chained, and the condition of the masses remained as miserable as possible. Nevertheless, after long centuries of suffering, as enlightenment spread through the world little by little, the masses who had been smothered under this nexus of privileges began to rebel against the privileged and to demand liberty, that is to say, the suppression of monopolies. The process took many forms. What happened in England, for example? Originally, the race which governed the country and which was militarily organized, the aristocracy, having at its head a hereditary leader, the king, and an equally hereditary administrative council, the House of Lords, set the price of security, which it had monopolized, at whatever rate it pleased. There was no negotiation between the producers of security and the consumers. This was the rule of absolutism. But as time passed, the consumers, having become aware of their numbers and strength, arose against the purely arbitrary regime, and they obtained the right to negotiate with the producers over the price of the commodity. For this purpose, they sent delegates to the House of Commons to discuss the level of taxes, the price of security. They were thus able to improve their lot somewhat, Nevertheless, the producers of security had a direct say in the naming of the members of the House of Commons, so that debate was not entirely open, and the price of the commodity remained above its natural value. One day, the exploited consumers rose against the producers and dispossessed them of their industry. They then undertook to carry on this industry by themselves and chose for this purpose a director of operations assisted by a council. Thus, communism replaced monopoly. But the scheme did not work, and 20 years later, primitive monopoly was reestablished. Only this time the monopolists were wise enough to not to restore the rule of absolutism. They accepted free debate over taxes, being careful, all the while, incessantly, to corrupt the delegates of the opposition party. They gave these delegates control over various posts in the administration of security, and they even went so far as to allow the most influential into the bosom of their superior council. Nothing could have been more clever than this behavior. Nevertheless, the consumers of security finally became aware of these abuses and demanded the reform of Parliament. This long-contested reform was finally achieved, and since that time, the consumers have won a significant lightening of their burdens. In France, the monopoly on security, after having similarly undergone frequent vicissitudes and various modifications, has just been overthrown for the second time. As once happened in England, monopoly for the benefit of one caste, and then in the name of a certain class of society, was finally replaced by communal production. The consumers as a whole, behaving like shareholders, named a director responsible for supervising the actions of the director and of his administration. We will content ourselves with making one simple observation on the subject of this new regime. Just as the monopoly on security logically had to spawn universal monopoly, so communistic security must logically spawn universal communism. In reality, we have a choice of two things. Either communistic production is superior to free production, or it is not. If it is, then it must be for all things, not just for security. If not, progress requires that it be replaced by free production. Complete communism or complete liberty. That is the alternative. Next chapter is titled Government and Society. But is it conceivable that the production of security could be organized other than as a monopoly or communistically? Could it conceivably be relegated to free competition? The response to this question on the part of political writers is unanimous. No. Why? We will tell you why. Because these writers, who are concerned especially with governments, know nothing about society. They regard it as an artificial fabrication and believe that the mission of government is to modify and remake it constantly. Now, in order to modify or remake society, it is necessary to be empowered with an authority superior to that of the various individuals of which it is composed. Monopolistic governments claim to have obtained from God himself this authority, which gives them the right to modify or remake society according to their fancy, and to dispose of persons and property however they please. Communistic governments appeal to human reason as manifested in the majority of the sovereign people. But do monopolistic governments and communistic governments truly possess this superior, irresistible authority? Do they in reality have a higher authority than that which a free government could have? This is what we must investigate. The divine right of kings and majorities. If it were true that society were not naturally organized, if it were true that the laws which govern its motion were to be constantly modified or remade, the legislators would necessarily have to have an immutable sacred authority. Being the continuators of providence on earth, they would have to be regarded as almost equal to God. If it were otherwise, would it not be possible for them to fulfill their mission? Indeed, one cannot intervene in human affairs. One cannot attempt to direct and regulate them without daily offending a multitude of interests. Unless those in power are believed to have a mandate from a superior entity, the injured interests will resist. Whence the fiction of divine right. This fiction was certainly the best imaginable. If you succeed in persuading the multitude that God himself has chosen certain men or certain races to give laws to society and to govern it, no one will dream of revolting against these appointees of providence, and everything the government does will be accepted. A government based on divine right is imperishable, on one condition only, namely that divine right is believed in. If one takes the thought into one's head that the leaders of the people do not receive their inspirations directly from providence itself, that they obey purely human impulses, the prestige that surrounds them will disappear. One will irreverently resist their sovereign decisions, as one resists anything man-made whose utility has not been clearly demonstrated. It is accordingly fascinating to see the pains theoreticians of the divine right take to establish the superhumanity of the races in possession of human government. Let us listen, for example, to Joseph de Maistre. He said, "Man does not make sovereigns. At the very most, he can serve as an instrument for dispossessing one sovereign and handing his state over to another sovereign, himself already a prince. Moreover, there has never existed a sovereign family traceable to plebeian origins. If this phenomenon were to appear, it would mark a new epoch on earth. It is written, 'I am the maker of sovereigns.' This is not just a religious slogan, a preacher's metaphor. It is the literal truth, pure and simple. It is a law of the political world. God makes kings, word for word. He prepares royal races, nurtures them at the center of a cloud which hides their origins. Finally, they appear, crowned with glory and honor. They take their places." According to the system which embodies the will of providence in certain men and which invests these chosen ones, these anointed ones with a quasi-divine authority, the subjects evidently have no rights at all. They must submit, without question, to the decrees of the sovereign authority, as if they were the decrees of providence itself. According to Plutarch, the body is the instrument of the soul, and the soul is the instrument of God. According to the divine right school, God selects certain souls and uses them as instruments for governing the world. If men had faith in this theory, surely nothing could unsettle a government based on divine right. Unfortunately, they have completely lost faith. Why? Because one fine day they took into their heads to question and to reason, and in questioning and reasoning, they discovered that their governments governed them no better than they, simply mortals out of communication with providence, could have done themselves. It was free inquiry that demonetized the fiction of divine right, to the point where the subjects of monarchs or of aristocracies based on divine right obey them only insofar as they think it in their own self-interest to obey them. Has the communist fiction fared any better? According to the communist theory, of which Rousseau is the high priest, authority does not descend from on high, but rather comes up from below. The government no longer looks to providence for its authority. It looks to united mankind, to the one, indivisible, and sovereign nation. Here is what the communists, the partisans of popular sovereignty, assume. They assume that human reason has the power to discover the best laws and the organization which most perfectly suits society, and that, in practice, these laws reveal themselves at the conclusion of a free debate between conflicting opinions. If there is no unanimity, if there is still dissension after the debate, the majority is in the right, since it compromises the larger number of reasonable individuals. These individuals are, of course, assumed to be equal, otherwise the whole structure collapses. Consequently, they insist that the decisions of the majority must become law, and that the minority is obliged to submit to them, even if it is contrary to its most deeply rooted convictions and injures its most precious interests. That is the theory, but in practice, does the authority of the decision of the majority really have this irresistible absolute character as assumed? Is it always, in every instance, respected by the minority? Could it be? Let us take an example. Let us suppose that socialism succeeds in propagating itself among the working classes in the countryside as it has already among the working classes in the cities. That it consequently becomes the majority in the country, and that, profiting from this situation, it sends a socialist majority to the Legislative Assembly and names a socialist president. Suppose that this majority and this president, invested with sovereign authority, decrees the imposition of a tax on the rich of $3 billion in order to organize the labor of the poor, as Proudhon demanded. Is it probable that the minority would submit peacefully to his to his iniquitous and absurd, yet legal, yet constitutional plunder? No, without a doubt, it would not hesitate to disown the authority of the majority and to defend its property. Under this regime, as under the preceding, one obeys the custodians of authority only insofar as one thinks it in one's self-interest to obey them. This leads us to affirm that the moral foundation of authority is neither as solid nor as wide under a regime of monopoly or of communism as it could be under a regime of liberty. The regime of terror. Suppose, nevertheless, that the partisans of an artificial organization, either the monopolists or the communists, are right, that society is not naturally organized, and that the task of making and unmaking the laws that regulate society continuously devolves upon men. Look in what a lamentable situation the world would find itself in. Lamentable situation, sorry. The moral authority of governors rests, in reality, on the self-interests of the governed. The latter having a natural tendency to resist anything harmful to their self-interest. Unacknowledged authority would continually require the help of physical force. The monopolist and the communists, furthermore, completely understand this necessity. If anyone, says M. de Maistre, attempts to detract from the authority of God's chosen ones, let him be turned over to the secular power. Let the hangman perform his office. If anyone does not recognize the authority of those chosen by the people, say the theoreticians of the school of Rousseau, if he resists any decision whatsoever of the majority, let him be punished as an enemy of the sovereign people. Let the guillotine perform justice. These two schools, which both take artificial organization as their point of departure, necessarily lead to the same conclusion. Terror. Let's move on to the free market for security. Allow us now to formulate a simple hypothetical situation. Let us imagine a newborn society. The men who compose it are busy working and exchanging the fruits of their labor. A natural instinct reveals to these men that their persons, the land they occupy and cultivate, the fruits of their labor, are their property, and that no one, except themselves, has the right to dispose of or touch this property. This instinct is not hypothetical. It exists. But man, being an imperfect creature, this awareness of the right of everyone to his person and his goods will not be found to the same degree in every soul, and certain individuals will make criminal attempts by violence or by fraud against the persons or the property of others. Hence the need for an industry that prevents or suppresses these forcible or fraudulent aggressions. Let us suppose that a man or a combination of men comes and says, "For a recompense, I will undertake to prevent or suppress criminal attempts against persons and property. Let those who wish their persons and property to be sheltered from all aggression apply to me." Before striking a bargain with this producer of security, what will the consumers do? In the first place, they will check if he is really strong enough to protect them. In the second place, whether his character is such that they will not have to worry about his instigating the very aggressions he is supposed to suppress. In the third place, whether any other producer of security offering equal guarantees is disposed to offer them this commodity on better terms. These terms are of various kinds. In order to be able to guarantee the consumers full security of their persons and property, and in case of harm, to give them a compensation proportioned to the loss suffered, it would be necessary, indeed, 1, that the producer establish certain penalties against the offenders of persons and the violators of property, and that the consumers agree to submit to these penalties in case they themselves commit offenses. 2, that he impose certain inconveniences on the consumers, with the object of facilitating the discovery of the authors of offenses. 3, that he regularly gather, in order to cover his costs of production as well as an appropriate return for his efforts, a certain sum, variable according to the situation of the consumers, the particular occupations they engage in, and the extent, value, and nature of their properties. If these terms, necessary for carrying on this industry, are agreeable to the consumers, a bargain will be struck. Otherwise, the consumers will either do without security or else apply to another producer. Now, if we consider the particular nature of the security industry, it is apparent that the producers will necessarily restrict their clientele to certain territorial boundaries. They would be unable to cover their costs if they tried to provide police services in localities compromising only a few clients. Their clientele will naturally be clustered around the center of their activities. They would nevertheless be unable to abuse this situation by dictating to the consumers. In the event of an abusive rise in the price of security, the consumers would always have the option of giving their patronage to a new entrepreneur or to a neighboring entrepreneur. This option the consumers retains of being able to buy security wherever he pleases brings about a constant emulation among all the producers. Each producer is striving to maintain or augment his clientele with the attraction of cheapness or of faster, more complete, and better justice. If, on the contrary, the consumer is not free to buy security wherever he pleases, you forthwith see open up a large profession dedicated to arbitrariness and bad management. Justice becomes slow and costly. The police vexatious. Individual liberty is no longer respected. The price of security is abusively inflated and inequitably apportioned according to the power and influence of this or that class of consumers. The protectors engage in bitter struggles to wrest consumers from one another. In a word, all the abuses inherent in monopoly or in communism crop up. Geez, could I stammer any more through that last one? Under the rule of free competition, war between the producers of security entirely loses its justification. Why would they make war? To conquer consumers? But the consumers would not allow themselves to be conquered. They would be careful not to allow themselves to be protected by men who would unscrupulously attack the persons and property of their rivals. If some audacious conqueror tried to become dictator, they would immediately call to their aid all the free consumers menaced by this aggression, and they would treat him as he deserved. Just as war is the natural consequence of monopoly, peace is the natural consequence of liberty. That's a good one right there. Let me say that a little louder for the people in the back. Just as war is the natural consequence of monopoly, peace is the natural consequence of liberty. Under a regime of liberty, the natural organization of the security industry would not be different from that of other industries. In small districts, a single entrepreneur could suffice. This entrepreneur might leave his business to his son or sell it to another entrepreneur. In larger districts, only one company by itself would bring together enough resources adequately to carry on this important and difficult business. If it were well managed, this company could easily last, and security would last with it. In the security industry, as in most of the other branches of production, the latter mode of organization will probably replace the former in the end. On the one hand, this would be a monarchy, and on the other hand, it would be a republic. But it would be a monarchy without monopoly and a republic without communism. On either hand, this authority would be accepted and respected in the name of utility, and would not be an authority imposed by terror. It will undoubtedly be disputed whether such a hypothetical situation is realized. But at the risk of being considered utopian, we affirm that this is not disputable, that a careful examination of the facts will decide the problem of government more and more in favor of liberty, just as it does all other economic problems. We are convinced, so far as we are concerned, that one day societies will be established to agitate for the freedom of government, as they have already been established on behalf of the freedom of commerce. And we do not hesitate to add that after this reform has been achieved and all artificial obstacles to the free action of the natural laws that govern the economic world have disappeared, the situation of the various members of society will become the best possible. So that's the end there of the book. So Gustave Molinari was born March 3rd, 1819, and he died January 28th of 1912, was a Belgian-born economist associated with the French Economistes, a group of laissez-faire liberals. Throughout his life, Molinari defended peace, free trade, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and liberty in all of its forms. He was the originator of the theory of market anarchism. So, yeah, that's pretty cool stuff, right? I think. So there's the back of the book right there. That was under an hour. Cool. So maybe we can read this other part here, but maybe some other time. We're going to be getting into some bigger projects on the channel coming up. There's probably going to be like a 4 or 5 part series that I'm going to be doing on the Men Against the State. Coming up real soon. Men Against the State is about the 19th century individualist anarchists, the development of individualist anarchism in the United States. And we're going to be getting into that pretty soon. Pretty excited about that, actually. And then after that, got some guests lined up for the near future. Some pretty exciting guests. Some new to the channel, some, actually all new to the channel, but some were featured on previous channels that I used to run. Arthur Sage in the chat said, "Isn't free market anarchism? It's mutualist. I don't get why doesn't anarcho-capitalist just call themselves mutualist or classical liberal?" It just comes down to a need to differentiate and to be more precise in terms, because unfortunately, classical liberalism is a thing. I understand where you're coming from. I understand what you're getting at, but to be more precise in defining the terms and saying, hey, I'd like to slap a label on myself. That's what anarcho-capitalists do. They don't call themselves this or they call themselves that because there has been discovered a name for what they believe in. I just tend to think more of myself as, as an individualist anarchist. And property rights are king. All rights stem from property rights. Individualist anarchism is also in bed with anarcho-capitalism to some degree, but yeah, I mean, I'm in the natural law camp myself, so like that's kind of where it comes down to, for me personally, mutualist. You know, it's just a matter of terms. It really just comes down to that. So I really liked this Molinari guy. The thing that always at the end of these like historic documents that always kind of like gets at me is the idea that a document like this being written 175 years ago, right? I say it all the time on the channel. What if this theory, what if this philosophy, what if this idea had been adopted and was like, brought into the fold as a, I guess, call it a mainstream idea? What kind of evolution could an idea like this have over 175 years? What kind of peace could an idea like this bring about over the course of 175 years? I cannot help but wonder, would we be seeing such violence on part of the state? The state has a monopoly on violence. That's what we live under. They rule through fear. It's not respect, it's fear. A friend of mine I was talking to the other, like a couple weeks ago, I've been on, there's an interview that he interviewed me a while back. His name's Sean McCann, and he's like my best friend. We were talking about all this a while back about like, their authority doesn't really exist, but yet, we protect ourselves by acting cautiously around these figures. When you're driving down the street and you're driving, you come across a police officer, you kind of go, oh geez, like, better put on my seatbelt or whatever. And, some people might laugh at that and be like, oh, I thought you anarchists thought that their authority didn't exist. But it's the same thing. And Sean puts it this way. He goes, it's the same thing as, swimming through water that is shark infested. You don't want to get bit. So I like the way that Sean broke that, kind of like broke that down. And it's really nice because it really puts the idea into perspective of like who it is that we're dealing with and what kind of terror we kind of live under. So when you're dealing with statists and you're out there in the world and you've got statist family members and, people that are, challenging your ideas and that are trying to, force feed you statism, just realize that they're so bought in and they're just afraid. They're just afraid. Some of the most afraid people are the ones that support cops the most. And it's really sad. So we got to have like a little bit of compassion for them, but through compassion, we urge to teach them. I urge you to teach them, because showing them the truth and helping them find the way is compassion. Letting them live down in the mud of ignorance is not compassion. And they're going to fight you and they might even dismiss you from their home or whatever, and respect it. But speak the truth. These people don't have the right to do what they're doing. They don't have the right to earn their wages off of money that was stolen from us, first and foremost. Most of the time, they're incorrect in their assessment of whether or not a crime was even broken, or a crime was performed, or a law was broken. Most of their laws are arbitrary. They have nothing to do with natural law. The ones that they enforce the most are simply just revenue generating, and that's all that they do. They are the sharks, and we need to avoid being bit by them. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be a little civil, practice a little civil disobedience from time to time. I'm just saying that simply that their authority extends pretty great these days, and that exercising a little caution around these animals might actually prove to, provide you with a little more length in your life. And the more people that understand this philosophy that remain alive for a long time and not behind bars, the more effective we are in our, bringing about more freedom. You see, there's plenty of things that we can all do to go say fuck you to the police and maybe, you know, do whatever. But if you're if you're incarcerated, if you're locked up and you understand the philosophy of freedom, you understand voluntarism, anarchism, and what it takes, like, I don't understand what good you're doing in a jail cell. I really don't. You know, we're not all, you know, going to be fighting the cops all the time. But, you know, it does to a degree. So here's something I've done in the past. Being pulled over, I ask questions. I go, do you like your job? Do you understand your job? Like I put it into perspective for them. I just ask them questions, hard questions. And if they give me a ticket or whatever, challenge it, see if you can get it dismissed, keep your revenue, keep your money out of the state's hands. You know, but they're human beings. Remind them of that. Remind them that they are human beings and that there is no difference between us and them. You know, they are pretty low conscious in the consciousness scale. They're the dogs of the state after all, but they are still physically in their corporeal form a human being, and they need to be brought out of the mind control. They are the most mind controlled. They're so mind controlled that they will perform the violent actions that keep the state alive. You see, the government is an egregore that's only able to live off of the fear of the people that it supposedly is in charge of. And the people that are imposing that fear the most are the order following cops that work for the government. So what we need to do in some way, if ever possible, is convince these people to quit their jobs. That is one way to really sweep the rug of authority, quote unquote authority, out from underneath the government. Is convince the police and the order following, you know, law enforcement officers to quit their jobs. They need to quit the cult of violence that they are a part of. And we will never, ever be able to accomplish anything like that if we're busy screaming fuck you in their faces, spitting on them, and just being generally assholes to them. They will exert their authority over you. I don't know if there's anything else that we can really do about that right now. Fighting them, they are a gang. They're the biggest gang. Fighting them is damn near useless. There are different ways to fight, however. Okay? A boxing match is not going to end up well. Fighting them with your brain and convincing them with your voice, that's a different fight completely, isn't it? Maybe that's the field on which we win the battle. I don't know. Only time will tell. So we gotta, you know, we gotta just push forward against this gang with love and compassion, the most that we can have, because that's what's going to win every time. Every time, you know, the universe respects love. That's what the universe operates off of. If we go around hating and disparaging each other, you're never getting anywhere. You're sinking in the mud. You're sinking in the mud like that horse in the never-ending story. What do we got here? We got a couple more people. Oh, I see Fred in the chat. What's up, Fred? Got mandatory myocarditis back. Thanks for, dude, this mandatory myocarditis. You're here like every night, dude. Oh, Arthur's back too. I asked a ANCOM, why did the ANCOM during the many anarchist liberation wars being fought and supported that if they took help from the ANCAP and Voluntaryist, they most likely see. Okay, would have won since they needed weapons like Catalonia before World War II. Like in Catalonia before World War II. I appreciate you jumping in the chat and keeping it active, Arthur. Unfortunately, that's a little... I don't mean to be offensive or anything, but that's a little unintelligible. I can't really make out what you're trying to say. Maybe it's me. I'm willing to accept that it's me. So voluntarism is the future. Okay. Voluntarism, this is the way that we take control of our actions as an individual. If we, in our own individual life, can perform actions voluntarily with one another. All like if you are not coercing others or transgressing upon others' natural law rights in any way, that's one step toward victory. Okay. And voluntarism brings about a condition of anarchism. I've said it before on the channel. I'll say it until I'm blue in the face. If we are currently living under a condition of slavery, if government really is slavery, and I do know that government is slavery, then anarchism is freedom. So we're living under a condition of government. If we want to live under a condition of anarchism, how do we get there? Voluntarism, being a voluntarist, is the set of actions. It's the criteria. It's what we as individuals can actually do. You can't do anarchy. Like, you can't do anarchy. You can do voluntarism. Voluntarism describes action. Anarchy describes a condition that is brought about by a certain set of actions. Okay? This is what I've been thinking about a lot lately. Challenge that thought of mine. I implore you. If there's another way of looking at it, let's talk, let's debate. But so far, this is what I've been able to come up with. And it's extremely important that people respect each other's natural law rights, because we all have the same ones. And wouldn't you like it if somebody respected yours? Don't you feel a little don't you get a little pissed off when somebody disrespects you or your natural law rights, I should say? So the golden rule is kind of how we go forward there from that point. You don't do unto others as you would not have done unto you. And treat others the way that you want to be treated. That type of stuff. I carry around with me, or I keep on my desk, this card, and I'll put it under the book cam. See if you can see it. It says, no matter what your day is like, be the kind of friend to others you want others to be to you. When you love others, they will love you. And, I really like that saying, and I can't remember where I found this card, but I have it nonetheless. And I think about it all the time. I think about this. I keep it on my desk so I can, have this nice little trinket that reminds me that this is a nice attitude to have, or a preferable attitude to have. And maybe if more people considered that for themselves, the world could be a better place. And, got a little background noise there, a little interference. That's okay. We can build a better future. No one man can do it. All right. No one woman can do it. Unfortunately, sometimes I feel like this is an unfortunate circumstance. We need to build it together. I wish I could do it alone. I would do it, but I don't really have the right to do that. But it's going to be difficult, but we got a big job ahead of us and we got to do it. There's a future coming. I'm not trying to create anxiety for anybody or to break free of present moment awareness, because in the present moment is where the work happens. But we work towards something, don't we? Isn't there always that little thought in the back of your head, like, oh geez, tomorrow's going to come? Even though the measurement of time might be a man-made construct, time itself does actually keep pushing forward. We age. And we recognize this aging process as the future, or the bringing on of a future. And it will happen. Even if a nuclear bomb goes off tomorrow, there's going to be a day after that. The universe decided that before any of us were even born. So what are we going to do? We're going to sit around with our thumbs up our asses watching Netflix all the fucking time? I enjoy a good movie every now and then. I watch some movies pretty regularly, actually, and I enjoy entertainment, but look, I don't know, you got to work for it. We got a future to think about. We got children to think about. People that are going to rely on others to create, to have some type of future that's worth living in. You know, there's forces at play out there right now that would love it if all of our freedoms were taken away from us. All of them, all of the freedoms, you know, but in order to achieve ultimate freedom, we can't let this flame die out. We must carry it on into the future. Continue working for change, continue working for liberty. And one day, my friends, it will be ours. And before you know it, we actually, you know, we might experience it in our lifetimes. Who knows? Anything could happen at this point. I'm not trying to sell any hopium here, but it is a dire situation that we are in. And only hard work will result in victory. Whatever any individual out there is capable of doing in order to achieve a greater state of freedom or a condition of freedom, we should be doing that. With that being said, I think that that's probably a good high note to end it on. The intro music is the same as the outro music. Brendan Daniel. The link is in the show notes. Go check him out on Instagram. I made friends with Brendan like a year and a half ago. And oh wait, before I really do a send off, Mandatory Myocarditis really just said something brilliant in the chat, and he's absolutely right. And he said, if the situation was hopeless, their propaganda would be unnecessary. Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. So yeah, Brendan Daniel on Instagram, go check him out. Brilliant artist. He's really good, really good. He came to the studio last August and recorded right here in the studio, and was very generous in giving me some music to use for the channel. Thank you, Brendan, if you're watching this, for that. And so, what else is there? voluntaristacademy.com. You can go over there and get all of the resources. You can check out all of the different things that I present on this channel and get your very own PDF copies of that. And while you're there, if you've enjoyed this and you seem to think that you're able to contribute to me, that would be great. You can do that there on the donation page or supports page. I always forget what it is, but the link for that's in the show notes. I appreciate that a lot. If you don't want to support me that way, that's fine too. You could just, like and subscribe to the channel, help get the word out of what I'm doing here by sharing it. Those are the easiest ways to support the channel. It really helps out a lot. And then finally, if you are now like how I was like a year and a half ago, then you might be thinking to yourself that there's more to life than maybe your current your current financial situation can bring you. And maybe you have ideas that you want to bring to the market, and you want to be a little bit more of an entrepreneur in your life. Maybe there are things like a podcast or some sort of media production that you have skills in, and you want to learn how to bring that skill to the market, and you're kind of lost. Well, I was there once too, and I heard about AUTONOMY. And AUTONOMY is a 12-week course that's hosted by Richard Grove of TragedyandHope.com, Peace Revolution podcast, and more currently the Grand Theft World podcast. And in those 12 weeks, I was absolutely floored. What was brought out of me was this better ability to communicate, this better ability to listen, this better ability to market my skills and to bring my ideas to the market and say, hey, look at me over here. I can do things. And I learned all that in AUTONOMY. And if you want to learn that too, you can click the link in the show notes, and it's an affiliated link. So if you do end up getting enrolled into the course, it does help me out. It helps me out a lot. And it helps you out, more importantly. It'll help you be a little bit more autonomous in your life. Not worry about being under the thumb or boot of some corporation, or even if you enjoy the job that you have, you could learn skills that make your position in that job a whole lot better. So consider that for yourself before you go. And if you ever want to come back, the link will be there. And other than that, I just want to remind everybody here and everybody listening to this that you own yourself, period. No one else owns you. You are truly not a slave. At the end of the day, you are not a slave. You are a conscious person having an experience in reality. And unfortunately, right now, there's been a lot of trickery afoot that has made it impossible for us to exercise our freedom to its fullest capacity. And I want to encourage you to break free from that bondage. And if you're here, you've already begun. I love you all. And with that, here's Brendan Daniel to play us out. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
These are the hills, and these are the hills we'll die on. It's where we plant our flag and what we